Go ahead, my son said with a smile. Mom already agreed to everything. 3 minutes later, their lawyer stopped reading, lowered the document, and stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. That was the moment my children realized they had celebrated far too early. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, a widow, a mother of 2 grown sons, and until that afternoon, everyone in that conference room believed I was a fragile old woman who no longer understood what was happening around her. The meeting was held on a rainy Thursday morning in downtown Chicago. The law office overlooked the river, and gray clouds pressed against the tall windows. Jason sat at one side of the polished conference table with his wife Amanda beside him. My younger son Ryan sat across from them. Both men wore dark suits. Amanda carried a leather portfolio and a smile she seemed unable to hide. They looked less like a grieving family and more like people waiting to collect a prize. Attorney Charles Bennett opened the folder in front of him and adjusted his glasses. He had worked with my husband and me for over 30 years. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his expression revealed nothing. That alone should have worried them. Before we begin, Jason said, leaning back in his chair, I just want to say that Mom has been very cooperative through this entire process. Amanda nodded quickly. We all want what's best for the family. I looked at her but said nothing. Silence can be surprisingly powerful when everyone expects you to defend yourself. The truth was that during the previous few weeks, I had listened carefully. I had listened when they talked about property values. I had listened when they discussed investment accounts. I had listened when they debated which rooms in my house would become a home office or a guest suite. Not once had anyone asked whether I planned to stay in that house. Not once had anyone asked how I was sleeping since losing my husband. They only spoke about what would happen after everything became theirs. Charles began reading. The sound of his voice filled the room. Legal terms. Asset descriptions. Account numbers. Every few minutes Amanda exchanged excited glances with Jason. Ryan tapped his fingers on the table, unable to hide his anticipation. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited. Outside, rain streaked the glass in long silver lines. Inside, everyone believed the story was ending exactly the way they wanted. Then Charles reached the final section. His voice slowed. He stopped. For the first time that morning, the room became completely silent. Jason frowned. What is it? Charles read one sentence. Just one. The color drained from Amanda's face. Ryan sat upright. Jason's confident smile vanished so quickly it was almost startling. No one spoke. No one moved. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic far below. Charles looked directly at me. I returned the look and offered the smallest smile. They had spent months planning their future. What they never realized was that I had spent those same months planning mine. And the story of how we arrived at that room was far more complicated than any of them could imagine. 3 months earlier, the house felt far larger than it had any right to. After 46 years of marriage, silence had become something I could hear. Every morning, I woke up at 6:30 without an alarm because that was when my husband, Edward, used to start the coffee maker. For the first few weeks after his passing, I still expected to hear footsteps in the hallway. I still glanced toward his chair in the kitchen. Grief does strange things. It teaches you how many parts of your life were built around another person. My home sat on 2 acres outside Chicago, surrounded by maple trees that Edward had planted decades ago. In the fall, the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold. He loved that view. Sometimes I would stand by the kitchen window holding a coffee mug, and imagine him standing beside me commenting on the weather. Those moments became fewer with time, but they never disappeared completely. What surprised me was not the loneliness. I expected loneliness. What surprised me was how quickly my children changed. During the first month, Jason called almost every day. Ryan visited every weekend. Amanda brought casseroles and spoke softly. They all seemed concerned. They all seemed supportive. Then little things began to shift. Conversations became shorter. Visits became more purposeful. Questions changed. One afternoon Jason sat at my dining room table and casually asked whether I had updated the deed to the house. He asked it with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. I remember looking at him for a moment before answering. Another time Ryan wanted to know whether his father had left detailed instructions regarding investment accounts. Amanda became interested in insurance policies, retirement funds, tax documents. The questions arrived one at a time. Each one sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern I could not ignore. The strangest part was what they never asked. They never asked whether I was eating properly. They never asked whether I was sleeping through the night. They never asked whether I felt safe living alone. It was as if my grief had become secondary to the paperwork surrounding it. One Sunday afternoon, Amanda arrived carrying a notebook. She sat across from me in the living room and smiled politely. Then she began listing renovations she thought would improve the property value of the house. New kitchen countertops, updated bathrooms, expanded office space. I listened quietly. Finally, I asked a simple question. Why are you discussing renovations? Amanda blinked. For a brief second, she seemed caught off guard. Then she laughed and said they were only thinking ahead. Thinking ahead. Those two words stayed with me long after she left. Later that evening, I walked through the house alone. Family photographs lined the hallway. Pictures from graduations, birthdays, vacations. Decades of memories looked back at me from polished frames. I stopped in front of one photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. Jason and Ryan stood beside Edward in the backyard. Everyone was smiling. Back then, I never would have imagined questioning their intentions. Back then, I believed family bonds were stronger than money. Standing there in the fading light, I felt the first crack appear in that belief. It was not anger. It was not even disappointment. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty can be far more unsettling. Because once you begin wondering whether people see you as a person or a possession, you start noticing things you once ignored. Looking back now, I realize that was the moment everything truly began. Over the next several weeks, I stopped correcting people when they assumed I was no longer paying attention. It was remarkable how much information people revealed when they believed an older woman had become invisible. Jason began stopping by more often, but his visits felt different. He spent less time in the kitchen sharing coffee and more time studying documents spread across my dining room table. One afternoon, he arrived carrying a folder and asked whether I still intended to maintain the entire property by myself. The question sounded innocent enough. I told him I had not made any decisions. He nodded, but I noticed the disappointment that briefly crossed his face. It vanished almost immediately. A few days later, Ryan called and suggested that perhaps the house was becoming too much responsibility. He mentioned retirement communities with fitness centers, social events, and maintenance services. His voice remained cheerful throughout the conversation, but something about the timing felt strange. I had never complained about caring for the house. I still mowed sections of the lawn with a riding mower. I still maintained the flower beds Edward and I had planted together. Yet suddenly everyone seemed concerned about my ability to remain independent. Amanda became even more attentive. She started sending links to real estate listings and articles about downsizing. Each message arrived wrapped in concern. Each suggestion sounded practical. Yet every recommendation pointed toward the same destination. Leave the house. Simplify your life. Make things easier. One evening I sat alone in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. I opened an old photo album that Edward and I had assembled years earlier. There were photographs from our first apartment, a tiny place with worn carpeting and second-hand furniture. We had almost nothing then. We worked long hours, saved every dollar we could, and built a life step by step. Looking through those pages reminded me of how much sacrifice stood behind everything we owned. None of it had appeared by accident. Every asset carried a story. Every room carried a memory. The following Sunday, the family gathered for dinner. Amanda brought dessert. Jason arrived with a bottle of sparkling water. Ryan came late and spent most of the evening checking his phone. The conversation drifted from weather to sports to local news. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Yet I could feel an invisible current running beneath the table. Every glance, every pause, every unfinished sentence seemed connected to something they were not saying. At one point, Jason asked whether I had reviewed all of the estate paperwork recently. Amanda immediately changed the subject after he spoke. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it lingered in my mind long after dinner ended. Later that night, after everyone left, I walked through the quiet house turning off lights. The silence felt heavier than usual. As I passed the staircase, I found myself looking toward Edward's study. The door remained exactly as he had left it. For reasons I could not explain, I stepped inside and sat at his desk. The room smelled faintly of old books and cedar wood. I opened the top drawer and rested my hand on a leather notebook he used for years. In that moment, a thought settled into my mind with surprising clarity. If my children were planning something, they believed they were several steps ahead of me. What they did not understand was that patience can reveal truths that questions never will. So I decided to stop looking for answers. Instead, I would wait. And before long, they would show me exactly who they were. The next clue arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, so quietly that I almost missed it. I had spent the morning trimming rose bushes near the front porch, and was carrying a basket of clippings toward the garage when I noticed Jason's SUV parked at the far end of the driveway. He was not supposed to visit that day. At first, I assumed he had come to check on me. That was what a son would normally do. But as I walked closer, I realized he was not looking toward the house at all. He was standing beside a man in a navy blazer, pointing toward different sections of the property. The two of them spoke for several minutes. The man occasionally wrote notes on a clipboard. I remained far enough away that neither of them noticed me. Eventually, the stranger shook Jason's hand and drove away. When Jason finally saw me, he smiled a little too quickly. "Mom, I did not realize you were outside." I returned his smile. "Who was your friend?" His expression changed for only a second. "Just someone from work." It was not a convincing answer. Jason had never brought co-workers to my property before. Still, I simply nodded and changed the subject. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table thinking about the encounter. The explanation itself did not bother me. It was the hesitation. People hesitate when they are searching for the safest version of the truth. Over the following week, similar moments began appearing everywhere. Ryan called twice asking whether I had considered obtaining a new appraisal for the house. Amanda sent an article discussing the advantages of liquidating large assets during retirement. Jason mentioned current real estate prices during nearly every conversation. Separately, none of it seemed remarkable. Together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One Friday afternoon, I decided to visit the local bank branch where Edward and I had done business for years. I did not go because I suspected fraud. I went because I wanted clarity. Sometimes peace of mind is worth more than certainty. The manager, a woman named Denise whom I had known for over a decade, greeted me warmly. We spent nearly an hour reviewing accounts, trust documents, and financial records. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been altered. Yet before I left, Denise said something that stayed with me. "You would be surprised how often families change after a loss." She spoke gently, almost apologetically. I asked what she meant. Denise folded her hands on the desk. "Money does not create character. It reveals it." The statement followed me all the way home. That night, I sat on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air carried the first hints of autumn. A cool breeze moved through the yard Edward loved so much. I found myself remembering conversations we had shared years earlier. Edward had always been practical. He believed that financial planning was not about wealth. It was about responsibility. "Assets are easy to leave behind," he once told me. "Values are harder." At the time, I thought I understood what he meant. Sitting there alone, I realized I was only beginning to understand it now. 2 days later, the family gathered again for Sunday dinner. Everything appeared normal. Amanda complimented the meal. Ryan discussed a business project. Jason talked about traffic and rising property taxes. The conversation flowed easily until they assumed I had stepped into the kitchen. In reality, I had paused just beyond the doorway after realizing I had forgotten the serving spoon. Their voices lowered immediately. Then I heard Amanda say something that made me stop moving altogether. "The sooner everything is settled, the easier it will be." No one disagreed with her. No one questioned what she meant. The silence that followed spoke louder than any explanation could have. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether they were merely planning for the future or quietly preparing to take control of it. I remained perfectly still behind the kitchen doorway. Amanda's comment hung in the air for several seconds before Ryan finally spoke. We just have to be patient. His voice was calm, almost casual. Jason sighed. I know. I am just tired of waiting. Waiting for what? That was the question echoing through my mind as I quietly picked up the serving spoon and returned to the dining room. By the time I sat down, all three of them were smiling again. The conversation shifted to football scores and weekend plans. Anyone walking into the room would have seen an ordinary family sharing Sunday dinner. Only I knew there was something else moving beneath the surface. That night, after everyone left, I cleaned the kitchen alone. The dishwasher hummed softly while rain tapped against the windows. I found myself replaying every word I had overheard. None of it was direct. None of it was proof. Yet instinct can recognize truths long before evidence arrives. The following week delivered that evidence. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Amanda called and asked whether she could stop by with some paperwork she wanted me to review. Her tone was cheerful, friendly, familiar. I agreed without hesitation. When she arrived, she carried a folder and 2 cups of coffee. We sat at the dining room table where she carefully arranged several pages in front of me. At first glance, the documents appeared harmless. Information about estate planning, property management, long-term living options. Amanda explained each page as though she were helping me prepare for the future. Then I noticed something. One section already contained handwritten notes. Someone had highlighted recommendations. Certain facilities were circled. Certain financial options were marked with stars. These were not ideas being explored. They were plans already under discussion. Who filled these out? I asked. Amanda froze for a fraction of a second. Oh, nobody. We were just brainstorming. I nodded slowly. Then I turned another page. There, written neatly in the margin, was Jason's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. I had spent years signing school permission slips and report cards. A mother never forgets her child's handwriting. Amanda noticed my expression and quickly gathered the papers together. Nothing is decided, she said. We are only trying to help. I smiled politely. Of course you are. She seemed relieved by my response. What she did not realize was that I had stopped believing in coincidences. After she left, I sat alone at the table staring at the empty chair across from me. Edward used to sit there every evening. Whenever life became complicated, he had a habit of simplifying things with one question. What are the facts? The facts were becoming clearer. My children were discussing my future without including me. They were making assumptions about my property. They were creating plans they expected me to follow. Whether their intentions were selfish or merely misguided no longer mattered. The result was the same. They had begun treating my life as a project to manage instead of a person to respect. The next morning I made a phone call. Attorney Charles Bennett answered on the second ring. We exchanged pleasantries before I got to the point. Charles, I said, I think it is time we reviewed every document Edward and I ever signed. There was a brief silence on the line. Then his voice became serious. I was wondering when you might call. At that moment I realized something important. I was not the only person who had noticed what was happening. And for the first time in months I felt something stronger than grief. I felt clarity. The following Tuesday I drove into downtown Chicago to meet Charles Bennett in person. His office occupied the same corner suite it had for years, overlooking the river and the rows of glass buildings beyond it. Walking into that office felt strangely familiar. Edward and I had spent countless afternoons there discussing investments, tax planning, and the future we hoped to leave behind. Charles greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. A thick stack of folders already sat waiting on the table. For nearly 2 hours we reviewed documents dating back more than 20 years. Trust agreements, property records, investment structures, business holdings. Most of it was exactly as I remembered. Then Charles opened a file I had not seen before. Edward asked me to keep this separate, he said quietly. My attention sharpened immediately. Charles slid a document across the table. It was dated 3 years earlier. I recognized Edward's signature at once. There was also a handwritten note attached to the front page. Seeing his handwriting after all those months felt like hearing his voice from another room. My hands trembled slightly as I read it. The note was brief. Edward wrote that wealth was never the true inheritance he wanted to leave our family. Character was. Responsibility was. Gratitude was. He explained that assets should reward those who respected family, not those who viewed family as an opportunity. When I finished reading, I sat silently for a long moment. Charles did not interrupt. Finally, I looked up. He suspected this might happen? Charles chose his words carefully. Your husband believes success can sometimes change people's priorities. He wanted safeguards in place just in case. The conversation that followed changed everything. Charles showed me several options Edward had authorized years earlier. Legal structures that could protect assets. Provisions that could redirect distributions. Conditions that could preserve Edward's wishes long after he was gone. None of it was impulsive. None of it was emotional. It was thoughtful, careful planning. For the first time in months, I felt as though Edward was still protecting me. Not through force. Not through control. Through wisdom. By the end of the meeting, I had made my decision. I was not going to argue with my children. I was not going to confront Amanda. I was not going to accuse anyone of anything. People reveal themselves far more clearly when they believe no one is watching. If I challenged them now, they would simply become more careful. Instead, I chose patience. Charles nodded when I explained my reasoning. That may be the smartest approach, he said. Over the next several weeks, we quietly updated documents and reviewed every detail. Nothing happened publicly. No announcements were made. No family meetings were called. Meanwhile, Jason continued discussing property values. Ryan continued suggesting lifestyle changes. Amanda continued presenting herself as helpful and concerned. I smiled. I listened. I thanked them for their advice. The more agreeable I appeared, the more confident they became. Looking back, that was the moment the balance of power shifted. They believed they were guiding events toward a conclusion they had already imagined. What they never realized was that the future they were planning no longer existed. And the trap they thought was waiting for me had quietly become a trap of their own making. The change in their behavior became impossible to miss once I stopped looking at them as my children and started looking at them as observers might. Confidence has a way of making people careless. Jason no longer hid his assumptions about the future. During one visit, he casually mentioned that the upstairs office would make an excellent workspace. He said it so naturally that for a moment it sounded as though he already owned the house. Ryan began discussing long-term financial strategies that depended upon assets he did not yet possess. Amanda was the most careful of the three, but even she started slipping. One afternoon she arrived carrying takeout lunches, and spent nearly an hour discussing improvements she believed would increase the property's market value. New landscaping, renovated bathrooms, updated flooring. Every suggestion treated the house as an investment rather than a home. I listened politely while making mental notes. What fascinated me was how little curiosity they showed about my actual wishes. They spoke constantly about plans, rarely about people. As autumn deepened, the maple trees surrounding the property turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Edward always loved this time of year. I often found myself walking the grounds in the late afternoon, reflecting on everything Charles and I had put into motion. The legal revisions were complete. The protections were secure. Every document had been reviewed multiple times. Yet outwardly nothing had changed. That was important. The illusion had to remain intact. One Sunday evening, the family gathered for dinner once again. The meal was pleasant. Amanda complimented the roast. Ryan shared a story about work. Jason talked about housing prices in nearby neighborhoods. Everything sounded normal until dessert was served. That was when Jason made a comment he clearly had not intended to reveal. Once everything settles, maintenance costs should be easier to manage. The words escaped before he could stop them. Silence followed. Amanda immediately reached for her coffee cup. Ryan stared down at his plate. I simply looked at Jason. He forced a laugh and attempted to explain himself, but the damage was already done. The statement revealed what they all believed. The future had already been divided in their minds. I smiled and changed the subject. The relief on their faces was immediate. That reaction told me even more than the mistake itself. They were not worried about hurting me. They were worried about being discovered. After they left, I sat alone in the living room watching the flames dance inside the fireplace. The house felt peaceful. For the first time in months, I was not angry. I was not even disappointed. Clarity has a calming effect. The truth was finally visible. My children had convinced themselves that patience entitled them to rewards. They had confused expectation with ownership. Most importantly, they believed I remained unaware of everything unfolding around me. That belief became the foundation of their downfall. Because while they continued imagining the future they expected to inherit, Charles and I were preparing a very different future. One built exactly according to Edward's wishes. A future that would test not how much they wanted but whether they deserved it at all. By early winter, the confidence in my family had grown into certainty. They no longer behaved like people waiting to learn the outcome of a decision. They behaved like people who believed the decision had already been made. The shift was subtle but impossible to miss. Jason began speaking about next year as though major financial questions had already been resolved. Ryan discussed investment opportunities he wanted to pursue once certain resources became available. Amanda started referring to long-term plans that conveniently depended upon assets she did not own. I listened to all of it without interruption. The more they talked, the more comfortable they became. And the more comfortable they became, the more they revealed. One afternoon, Amanda invited me to lunch at a small restaurant overlooking the river. The conversation began pleasantly enough. She asked about my health. She asked whether I had been sleeping better. Then, almost seamlessly, she steered the discussion toward the future. She spoke about simplifying responsibilities, about reducing stress, about enjoying retirement without the burden of maintaining a large property. Her words were polished and carefully chosen. Yet every road seemed to lead toward the same destination. The house, the land, the assets attached to them. As she spoke, I found myself studying her expression. She genuinely believed she was being persuasive. Perhaps she even believed she was being helpful. What she did not understand was that I had already heard enough months earlier. The conversation changed nothing. It merely confirmed what I already knew. A week later, Charles called to tell me everything was ready. Every revision had been finalized. Every document had been executed properly. Every safeguard was in place. His voice carried a quiet confidence I had not heard before. When the call ended, I sat in Edward's study for a long time. Snow drifted past the windows in slow white spirals. The room felt peaceful. For the first time since losing him, I felt as though I was carrying out a promise rather than managing a crisis. The days passed quickly after that. Holiday gatherings came and went. Family dinners continued. Smiles continued. So did assumptions. Then Charles contacted everyone and scheduled a formal meeting at his office. The reason was simple. Certain estate matters required review. The response from my family was immediate. Jason sounded eager. Ryan sounded curious. Amanda sounded almost excited. None of them realized how much their reactions revealed. On the morning of the meeting, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching pale winter light spread across the property. The maple trees stood bare against the gray sky. Everything looked still. Everything looked unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, everything was different. I dressed carefully and drove into the city. When I arrived at Charles's office, everyone was already there. Jason greeted me with unusual warmth. Ryan smiled. Amanda offered coffee. Their confidence filled the room before a single word was spoken. They believed they were about to watch the final chapter unfold exactly as they had imagined. I took my seat and folded my hands in my lap. Across the table, Charles opened a folder and adjusted his glasses. Outside the conference room windows, snow continued to fall over Chicago. Inside, an entirely different storm was about to begin. Charles began reading in the calm, measured voice that had guided families through important decisions for decades. The room remained relaxed at first. Jason leaned back in his chair. Ryan occasionally glanced toward the folder on the table. Amanda sat with her hands folded neatly, her expression composed and confident. The first several pages contained information everyone already expected. Property descriptions, financial summaries, trust structures. Nothing surprising. Every few minutes, I noticed small signs of growing anticipation. A glance exchanged between Jason and Amanda, a faint smile, A posture that suggested victory was only moments away. I remained silent. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, Charles continued turning pages. Then he reached the final section. The atmosphere changed immediately. His pace slowed. He adjusted his glasses and reread a paragraph quietly to himself. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crossed his face. Jason noticed it first. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Charles did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. I nodded once. The room became very still. Then Charles read the final provision aloud. According to Edward's instructions, all major distributions would remain protected within the family trust, unless beneficiaries demonstrated a consistent pattern of supporting, respecting, and maintaining meaningful family relationships. Furthermore, any beneficiary shown to have treated inheritance as an entitlement rather than a responsibility would forfeit direct control of those assets. The assets would instead be redirected into a charitable foundation established in Edward's name, supporting scholarships, community programs, and family assistance initiatives. Silence followed. Complete silence. Jason stared at Charles as though he had misunderstood the words. Ryan blinked several times before speaking. "What does that mean?" Charles calmly explained that Edward had included extensive review provisions years earlier. Correspondence, documented conduct, financial discussions, witness statements, and recorded planning meetings had all been evaluated according to the conditions he established. Amanda's confidence vanished first. The color drained from her face. Jason sat forward abruptly. Ryan looked from one person to another, searching for an explanation that did not exist. Charles continued reading. Edward had left a personal statement. It was short. He wrote that wealth should strengthen character, not replace it. He wrote that gratitude mattered more than ownership. Most importantly, he wrote that no inheritance should reward those who forgot the difference between family and opportunity. By the time Charles finished, nobody was smiling anymore. Jason opened his mouth several times before finding words. Amanda stared down at the table. Ryan looked genuinely stunned. As for me, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Relief. Months of uncertainty simply disappeared. Edward's voice seemed present in that room through every sentence he had written. The future he wanted had survived him. Slowly, I stood and picked up my purse. No speech was necessary. No argument remained worth having. Charles closed the folder. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. As I walked toward the door, I paused only once. "Your father spent a lifetime building something meaningful," I said quietly. "He hoped one day you would understand why." Then I left the conference room. Behind me, nobody followed. For the first time in a very long time, I stepped into the future carrying exactly what mattered and leaving everything else behind.